all right. I'm recording anyway. They can catch up then. We have what to do. So back to the brain, which for many of you will be novel. All right. So we ended with the thalamus, that relay center that does more than just relay sensory information. You might recall, we're dealing with a certain amount of processing that goes on, inputs from a variety of areas. The next one we're going to go to is the hypothalamus. Again, a lot of integration of all of these activities. So there's a great deal that goes on thalamically, if you want to make an adverb out of it, which I always do. So below the thalamus, as the name would suggest, is the hypothalamus. And this is a really important area. Number one on the head parade, this is where the blood-brain barrier is weakest. Why is that significant? Because this is one of those limited areas where information contained in the bloodstream can be assessed, evaluated. So we're looking at calcium levels, sugar levels, a variety of other electrolyte levels, a variety of chemical levels that are assessed there. Normally, what goes on in the bloodstream is sort of sequestered from the brain. It's very interesting cellularly, and that's why, as you might recall me mentioning about Parkinson's disease, we have to use a precursor substance called L-DOPA, at least originally, unless they've modified that over the years, to effectively add dopamine, because that will cross the blood-brain barrier, where dopamine, being an amine, is water soluble and will not. So that's really the important aspect of the hypothalamus. A lot of sensing of the environment, and therefore a lot of input vis-a-vis homeostasis and negative feedback. So and it's not all the structure. There's a lot of complexity in a relatively small area that you're going to be very unimpressed by when you do the sheep brain dissection. And good news, the brains are in. Happy dance. That's right. We're dissecting on Monday. So just some ideal structures. Now, the mammillary body's named, and on the sheep, you don't see it as much well as you see it on our brains, because they're like two rounded, elevated projections. They remind the anatomists of breasts, where they were. And very importantly, this is called the infundibulum. You'll get a lot more about this in physiology. This is a stalk-like projection of the hypothalamus that really forms much of what's called the posterior pituitary. So the pituitary gland is sort of like a double gland in the sense the anterior portion is glandular, the posterior portion is really an extension of the brain. So its secretions effectively are what are called neurotransmitters and play an important role in governing pituitary activity and even being directly released into the bloodstream. There's a lot that goes on with that. And you can see there are a lot of nuclei that are names you don't have to know, that are there. But you can see the supraoptic nuclei, because it's above the optic chiasm where the optic nerves cross, it's called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, et cetera, et cetera. So when you go into actual like neuroanatomy at a graduate or medical school level, you learn a lot more about that. But each of these plays a particularly interesting role. There have been some, and it's a difficult area when there's malfunctions because of this important role in homeostasis. So every so often you'll hear about somebody, if you want to use the term famous or noteworthy, who has succumbed. And the one that I'm thinking of was a very brilliant comedic actor back in the 80s named Dudley Moore. And I think he had lesions or problems in either the supraoptic or suprachiasmatic nucleus. Died in his 40s. Very interesting. Did a wonderful movie called Arthur. There were two pieces. The first one was wonderful, brilliant theme music that had Liza Minnelli as sort of the comic and love interest as part of it. Very, very interesting movie. So the visceral control and regulating center for homeostasis. So its big deal as it works through the autonomic nervous system, which means the nervous system we can't control. So whether it's blood pressure based on whether it's osmolality or various electrolytes, Heartbeat plays a role with regard to this because we're adjusting it vis-a-vis blood pressure, sometimes respiration, digestive tract, pupillary size, etc. So all of those are part of it. And as you can see, it plays an important role in our emotions. It's really technically, it's part of the limbic system. We haven't seen a diagram of all the structures of the limbic system. We shall fairly soon, certainly today. And so this limbic area is part of how you and I perceive various things. So a lot of times when you hear about folks with whether it's problems with rage or road rage and anger management, and they can be stemming from this as well as other areas in the limbic system. And then when they talk about biological rhythms and drives, they're another thing that is regulated by hormonal secretions that come from this area. So you can't really limit the impact of the hypothalamus. And so I think that's important. Also, all of those things, when we talk about in the initial thing, we looked at homeostasis. What does your body do? When you're cold, you shiver, you generate heat. When you're hot, you perspire and sweat, and as you evaporate, it cools you. So you have body temperature regulation, hunger and thirst, satisfactory levels, etc. Here's that suprachiasmatic nucleus, sets our biological clock. Sleep-wake cycles are very interesting. You can modify them depending on, but most of us, it's we typically have the typical, we wake up in the morning, we go to bed at night. This is, pretty much prime time, and it varies depending on what you do, whatever shift you're going to work. If you do shift work, that kind of a thing. And some people just are more natural. I've always been a morning person, and a lot of that came from I was doing a lot of operating. You generally operate first thing in the morning. They get those things started at 7 o'clock in the morning. So you're generally, if you're doing a lot of surgery, that's the time you do it. You see patients in the afternoon. And you kind of get set on that. Even when I was a resident, we'd be in there making rounds, pre-op rounds at 6 o'clock in the morning, all that type of stuff. Let's see. Endocrine function, as I said, it plays a pivotal role in governing the functionality of the pituitary. And there's a series of hormones as well that play a pivotal role because they basically upregulate and downregulate pituitary function, plus some of them function independently. We see this in physiology in the second half of the course when we start talking about things like antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin and other chemicals. GnRH, for instance, we'll get to gonadotropin-releasing hormone, etc. So a lot of these things that play a role, because remember, hunger and thirst, so wasting diseases are part of that. It's almost like failures to thrive. Eating disorders / obesity, sleep disturbances, all of these things. And there's a variety, and this could be true for any abnormality that we see in the central nervous system: tumors, radiation, surgery, trauma, infection, figure something. So very often it's just a question of trying to find out what's causing the damage as to if you can treat it, and if you can treat it, how do you treat it? Because unfortunately not everything is treatable. In modern medicine, we very rarely say curable. We typically, treatable is a good word. Reversible is a good word. Irreversible and untreatable are bad words. So it's a different world today with regard to the language of medical intervention that's there. Now, this is interesting because we're not 100% sure as to its role. It's called the epithalamus because it's above it, the roof of the third ventricle. And however you pronounce it, because it looks like a pine cone, so you can see pineal or pineal, okay? And you'll be able to see that very clearly because it looks like a little pine cone. Actually, when you look at the cleft between the cerebrum and the cerebellum, you look inside there and voila, there will be, and we know it secretes melatonin. And melatonin certainly plays a role, again, with various types of cyclical events. What it does after that is not necessarily that clear. Melatonin, I may have mentioned it before, you can get as a supplement. And a lot of people do that when they have trouble sleeping. A lot of people do have trouble sleeping. But the problem is that it can affect different people differently. So that's the kind of thing where you do a trial dose one night when you don't have to go anywhere the next day. Because you could be, not in good shape to drive a car or operate machinery. until you know how it affects you specifically. People are, and that's sort of the hidden thing, because these are in the category of supplements and they're not necessarily governed. I was reading an article. I mean, the supplement industry is wild. Okay, and again, these are things that, although they are tested, they are not necessarily under the auspices of the Food and Drug Administration. So you have to be kind of cautious with those things. I'm not. I take a bunch. I used to joke, my wife gives me a bowl of these every night. 63 different kinds of vitamins and calcium and magnesium. Ugh. So again, this is a view you're going to see a lot of. And just to review, here you can see the pituitary gland here, proximity to the optic chiasm. They're just showing it two-dimensionally here, and it won't be nearly as impressive in the sheep as the hypothalamus. So the stalk of the infundibulum is roughly here, and then this is posterior, this is anterior pituitary. There's the thalamus, there's the epithalamus. This reddish area is, and you'll see that as well as in the lateral ventricles and also here in the fourth ventricle, is called a choroid plexus. That's one of the areas where we see production, or a better word would be finalization, of what is the cerebrospinal fluid. It's their same basic illustration, except it's not an illustration, it's actual brain, which brings us to some different views where you go, and this is all, once we remove the thalamic area, at that point, this is all brainstem. It's really important. So we can take a look here. You'll see this is the course of the optic nerve. Here's the chiasm as the optic nerves come in, crosses over, and then you're going to see they carry themselves back to the thalamic area and then are projected farther backwards. These are called peduncles. So these are known as cerebral peduncles. If you recall me telling you about that really significant corticospinal tract, the pyramidal tract, the peduncles are representative of the white matter that goes through that particular tract. When we get to another view where we see the cerebellum, you're going to see they're called cerebellar peduncles. Peduncles are kind of like pillars. Is really where the derivation is. So you think of ancient Rome and ancient Greece and the architecture there and the different pillars that they had holding up a variety of buildings and edifices. Not often you get to use edifice in a sentence. I can remember Mrs. Ross, my sixth grade elementary English teacher. And she was always, I want you to take out your vocabulary builder. Little did I know how much fun that would be. And then you're going to see, this is also gives you an idea of some of the cranial nerves, which we're going to get to in laboratory relatively soon. And here again, the peduncles, and the distinction, the peduncles are really roughly at the level of the midbrain over here. When you see these sort of gyri that are going horizontally, this is pons. It juts forward. It indicates there's like a belly-like protuberance. Here's the rest of the pyramids as they've crossed over. So these are actually the true pyramids that are there, and you can see a variety of cranial nerves. So it's an interesting view. When we look at it from the side, which they had before, and I sort of pointed at, you can see it here. You can see the pituitary gland. You can see the thalamus. This is called the optic tract. So it goes back into the thalamic area, and then from there it's going to go farther backwards, something called the optic radiation. And you can see these little bumps, which you will see, two on the right and two on the left, named superior and inferior, and the word is colliculus is the single, or colliculi, obviously would be the plural. What's interesting about them is they are really important reflex processing centers to sight and sound phenomena. So the best example is if all of a sudden you hear somebody does that, and you look up to see where the sound is. That's a reflex activity. That's from the inferior colliculi. If you catch a flash or something, like you're at home and all of a sudden there's a flash of lightning, and you sort of look that way, that's the superior colliculi. So they're head and neck reflexes based on sight or sound. And like all reflexes, they're by and large protective. They're designed for to help us, and sort of giving us, pardon the phrase, a heads up as to what's kind of coming in your direction. So that's where, and you'll see them a little bit better back here. So here you can see the superior and the inferior colliculi, because they're four bodies of nervous material or cell bodies. They're called the corpora quadragemini of the tectum. Fancy name. Corpora is body, quadragemini means four ganglia, four networks of cell bodies that are there. And then what you're looking at here is sort of the anterior most aspect of the fourth ventricle, and yet another choroid plexus that's there. So there's a really, to me, very interesting view. Here's the pineal gland. So you'll see this view, actually, when you look at the sheep brain. Now, I would encourage you to take a look at it. Lastly, of the brain areas, with the exception of the cerebellum, we have the brain stem. And it's a little easier to understand its functionality. The problem is this is really where you don't have conscious control over it. So when there's damage there, it almost inevitably involves autonomic dysfunctions. When I say that, it could interrupt breathing and heart rate and blood pressure and all the things we don't give a second thought to unless we have problems with them. And by and large, most of the time, how do we deal with things like that? It's lifestyle changes, dietary changes, exercise, medicines if necessary. So when there's damage to a brainstem or a brainstem injury, it generally has a fairly ominous prognosis. In order from superior to inferior, top to bottom, the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. They are very similar to spinal cord, but here we still have, in the spinal cord, we have gray matter around the central canal and that very distinctive butterfly shape you might recall initially, and then white matter. Here you still have some islands of gray matter we refer to as nuclei, because they're clusters of gray matter in cell bodies. Autonomic or automatic behaviors, tracks, relays up and down. Most of the cranial nerves, the only two that don't come from here, the one that comes from the cerebral area is olfactory, and the one that comes from the diencephalon or thalamic area is the optic. That's 1 and 2. And after that, the next ones are all coming out of here. And you'll probably see at least 5 of them when we do the dissection. They're pretty easy. After that, on the sheep, they just look like little threads. And they're fairly difficult to visualize. So this is a view you'll see a lot of. This is the ventral view. Some people call it the inferior view of brain itself. And so all of these projections, for instance, that's a cranial nerve, that's the optic chiasm, these are the olfactory bulbs. You'll see all of these. Okay, you'll see this. You'll probably see the oculomotor nerve. You may or may not see the trochlear nerve. That's the only one that comes from the posterior aspect. And then here, the very famous trigeminal nerve. We'll get into chapter and verse about that, just to give you some idea. And you'll see the schematic, I'm sure, afterwards. Okay, the midbrain between the diencephalon and the pons. It's the only area that really maintains itself from gestational phase, because it was mesencephalon. So mes means middle. So the mesencephalon and the midbrain really doesn't have a lot of change other than subtle changes over time. The cerebral peduncles with the pyramidal tracts, again, pillars that hold up the cerebrum, is where they get their name. The opening that runs through it, and you will see this on the dissection, because you'll see that area with the colliculi posteriorly and the remainder of the midbrain anteriorly, you'll actually be able to take a look at that cerebral aqueduct area. That channel is very distinctive. You'll see a lot of gray matter with nuclei that are part of it. This is certainly fight or flight. Pain suppression is interesting. It's remarkable how we have the capability of doing that. And it's like an override so we can function when there's a great deal of pain that's coming up. Most of the time, it's causing certain neurotransmitters, mostly glutamate, to be produced. For a long time, before we had different approaches And mistakenly, for about 30 years, we mistakenly used a lot of opioid agents. That's where we have all this problem with OxyContin and things like that. They mistakenly didn't think they were addictive. Anybody in the world could have told them. I have no idea how that whole conundrum presented itself when we had so many people with it. We used to use agents called tricyclic antidepressants. The particular one that I used was called Elavil. And I would do that for diabetics who had a lot of pain called peripheral neuropathy pain. And that would be an agent that we would give them in an effort to alter the release of those neurotransmitters. So in an effort to augment or make the best of this pain suppression mechanism. So I prescribed a lot of that over the years. You saw that illustration. Corpus quadrigemini, the colliculi are visual, inferior. And now you're going to see two areas that have a lot of pigmentation. One's called the red nucleus, and the other one is called the substantia nigra, which means black stuff. Big term in Latin. It's like people on their emails go, carpe diem. You seen that? Seize the day. What are you going to do with it once you grab it? I could say seize the steak, seize the pizza. So the pathway from the substantia nigra, and this is the very famous pathway. It goes from the substantia nigra, so it's called nigra. And you remember, the corpus striatum was part of the basal nuclei, which play this role, nigrostriatal, and they produce dopamine, which is the neurotransmitter derived from tyrosine, nigrostriatal dopamine pathway. And this is the one that's associated with an insufficient amount, in some cases, perhaps more commonly in traditional Parkinson's disease. And that's where that L-DOPA uses. The other one of these interesting, dopamine, even though it's not addictive, plays a very significant role in addictive disease. Remember, the name of this is the mesencephalon. So it's called the mesolimbic because it's going to basically your pleasure center, which is part of the limbic system, dopamine pathway. That is the pathway that's probably the most significant for addictive diseases. Early on in my teaching career, a good 25 years ago, for about 5 or 6 years, I taught a course in addictive diseases. And the single most important feature in addictive diseases is reinforcement. How much pleasure you get from whatever you're doing that's addictive, whether it's taking certain drugs, gambling, doing dangerous behaviors. Think of something that's addictive, smoking, etc. That's the big issue. That's the hardest part to control. That's why we have things that can addict a person on the first go round, because the pleasure is so intense, and particularly if it's delivered rapidly, like by inhaling it. That's why smoking is so difficult to deal with, because you're inhaling nicotine, and then nicotine triggers the center. Now, I'm an expert on that, as you already know. So it's very, very difficult. Alcohol is another one that's very, very difficult to deal with, even though it's ingested oral. That's there. If you talk to people in the addictive disease fields, it's real tough. Long-term alcoholics are very, very tough. It's easy to fall off the wagon. It's been 15 years. I haven't fallen off the smoking wagon yet. Thank goodness. So that's one. The red nucleus plays a role. The reticular formation is this series of pathways that come from the spinal cord, from your eyes, from your ears, from a lot of different receptors that wake you up. So they're called arousal center. Not arousal in the sense of sexual arousal, but awake and alert. Something that many of you would typically listening to me would benefit by. That's why I do crazy things. Take my students. Please take my students. I was getting, wait, you should have been there over the weekend. All I did was get yelled at. My wife's gone for a few days. The house is a mess. Yes? Did you clean out the cat litter? No. It's like, Everything I did was wrong. Consistent. I took out the garbage. Nobody cares. Well, and I took care of the dog. He cared. Well, you can sleep with the dog. She sleeps with the dog. I sleep in the crate. It's a big crate. It's all right. If he's got a nice thick, blankety thing. It's a little bit. Just saying. So, moving on. So this is what it looks like. It kind of looks like a smiley face. So here you are. Here's the aqueduct. This is all they call it periaqueductal gray matter. So there's a lot of gray matter that's here. Nuclei for the oculomotor nerves. This is the tectum is another name for part of those colliculi, the gray matter that's there. Down the road, depending on where you go to the career, you'll learn about things called the medial and lateral meniscus. So here you have the red nuclei, and this is the very famous substantia nigra. And here are those peduncles. Those are all substantial amounts of tracts carrying motor information. In between these two structures is the pons. So it's between the midbrain and the medulla, and behind it, and we'll get to that today because it's really important, is the cerebellum. So conducting tracts, longitudinal fibers with higher brain centers, and then so up and down, you're getting impulses going up and impulses going down, for sure. But they have a lot of fibers going back to the cerebellum. The cerebellum, you will see, has fibers that go back to the pons, go down from the spine, come up from the spinal cord, sends additional fibers that go up to the brain. There's a lot of interplay, and you're going to see the name of those tracts are called cerebellar peduncles as we get to them. Cranial nerves, significant, 5, 6, and 7 are stated as pons. I would argue that 5 and 6 certainly are. 7 and 8 are probably what we call the pontine medullary junction, so it's not quite exactly there. So, and they play a role in, again, that awakened alertness, normal, and a lot of the rhythms. There's a lot of control. It's like a metronome for breathing. We breathe at a steady rate, and there's a lot of interplay between control centers in the brain stem area, mostly between the medulla and the pons, where it sets up these rates and rhythms that control functions that we don't even think about. Heart rate, breathing, aspects of circulation, etc. So it doesn't look a whole lot different. The distinctive feature is this. The thickest, the largest of the cranial nerves, because it's 3 nerves wrapped into one, is the trigeminal nerve. So that's where trigeminal comes from. There's actually 3 substantial roots or ganglia of the nerve. Here you can see the reticular formation. The 4th ventricle is larger than the aqueduct, and you're going to see that choroid plexus that's there. This is still that sort of anterior bulge has to do with the pyramidal tracts that are there. So there's a lot to it. And then lastly of the stem is the medulla. And the medulla at the foramen magnum relatively abruptly makes a transition from brainstem to spinal cord. Now, in the last PowerPoint of this chapter, we look at the spinal cord and the tracts. So we're not going to spend a lot of time on that today. So the foramen magnum is sort of that dividing line. And we have a lot of those. And it's interesting how rapidly the transition is from one kind of anatomy to typical spinal cord anatomy. So the medulla and pons are the ventral wall of that 4th ventricle. The choroid plexes are there. And they're saying forms the cerebrospinal fluid. Again, cerebrospinal fluid has a lot of aspects of plasma. So it's water and electrolytes. It's just varying composition for what we see in the bloodstream. So there's things that are there and things that, for instance, white blood cells generally are not there. When you have white blood cells in your cerebrospinal fluid, that's an infection. You have meningitis. And that's one of the reasons why a very, very significant diagnostic test is lumbar puncture or a spinal tap. We'll get a bit to that when we look more at the spinal cord and the anatomy of that. Very significant, used more frequently than you might think. particularly so in little children. Okay. But even I, as an adult, had a spinal tap. I had just come full time here in like 2010, and I've been here like Dr. Hannah and I both came on board around 2008, and then we both became full time in 2010. I understand why they wanted her. I'm still not. I have no freaking clue why they wanted. She's talented. I'm just here. Thank you for agreeing.
You're welcome. They have to have you about.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
And all like the good people, then they can.
Yeah, I know. They can bring us
Yeah.
for comedic value.
Yeah.
Entertainment value. Where was I? Okay. So our offices were both downstairs below where the dean's office, totally different than what it was here. Now, like engineering labs are down, you can't even access it. There's a stairway. And I was teaching adjuncting at CCAC, and I taught here during the day, went to CCAC. All of a sudden, I'm doing a lab and like micro, and all of a sudden I'm getting hot and chilled simultaneously. The next thing I know, I'm lying out of nowhere. And the next thing I know, I'm calling my wife was at that time, we were not married at that time, we were engaged at that time, waiting for our divorces to come through. And so she zipped over and insisted that I go to the emergency room where I had nearly 104 fever. And they couldn't figure out why it was. It was a spinal tap, which thankfully wasn't meningitis. Turned out to be an infection in my leg that I had from an old injury there. I didn't even know they gave it to me because he gave me some kind of narcotic that made me less combative than I usually am. Moving on. So the pyramids are these longitudinal ridges on the anterior aspect. You don't see it so well in the sheep. They decussate or cross over there. There are also swellings called olives. And that has and the olivary nuclei, and again, not nearly as distinctive as they are in our brain on the sheep brain, which is considerably smaller. They have to do a lot with information as to joint and muscle positioning. So they have stretch receptors is what they're defining. Collectively, that's a really important name that I talk about a lot, and when we get to cerebellum shortly, you'll see it. It's called proprioceptors. Proprioceptors give your body, your brain, at the cerebellum, information as to body position. Like all of you know you're sitting now. Okay, that's because of that. So if you close your eyes, you know where you're sitting, you know where your hands are, whether they're folded in front of you, whether you're writing something, whether you have them on top of a keyboard, wherever they are. No one has to tell you that, but your brain has already got that information. And that has to do with the olivary nuclei, for instance. The remaining cranial nerves, 8, 9, 10, 12, and a substantial part of 11. We'll get to 11 with your cranial nerves. So all of those things, the ear is vestibular cochlear, because that's vestibular is balance, cochlea is hearing. Okay. Again, in advanced anatomy at the graduate or medical school level, you talked about cuneatus and gracilis, and these are part of what are called dorsal columns. I'll talk a little bit about that when we get to the spinal cord. That's an area that's frequently damaged in certain diseases. And have you seen all those illustrations? So here's a pretty good look at the medulla. The olivary nuclei don't project, but they look kind of rounded in cross-section to anatomists. And the same thing, again, the medial and lateral lemniscus areas, again, playing a significant role with regard to some of that ascending sensation, body position. Here you can see the pyramids, so they sort of, the way the anatomist looks at it, you had a base and you would appear to be like a tip of a pyramid. And you can see a lot of these different nuclei, many for cranial nerves. So it's a reflex center. It overlaps with the hypothalamus. It joins with the pons with adjusting heart rate and blood vessel diameter for blood pressure regulation. Respiration obviously is a significant part of that. All of these variety of reflexes or responses are all protective in nature. when you ingest something that's toxic, frequently you will vomit. So vomiting is more often probably due to something that your body is almost telling you, this is not good for me. I got to get rid of it. Okay. Hiccuping is diaphragmatic spasm that has to go with sometimes certain particles or certain materials, part of like almost like an allergic response. Swallowing, coughing, and sneezing, all of these are regulated and they have to function normally. That's you also play a role in your gag center. And gag center is something that's pretty significant. Okay, as folks get older, it's not quite as sensitive as it is for young. It's like when you have they're putting in a tongue depressor to want to look at your throat. Normally, they're doing a throat swab, like for strep throat. Folks like you will gag. Older folks, it's not quite as distinctive. Okay, which brings us to the cerebellum. So cerebellum is the second largest area of the brain. It's sort of behind the pons and the medulla, and between the pons and medulla and the cerebellum is this very large ventricle called the fourth ventricle, and it processes inputs from everywhere. Inputs from the brain stem, from a variety of receptors. So what this allows you to do, and I say it all the time, and I'll write it down again just because it's important. It's called ipsilateral motor coordination. Do remember that. That's a test question. Ipsilateral means same side motor coordination. So when I'm doing that, think of all the other things I have to do other than lift my arm up and write. I have to balance myself, I have to adjust my position to do so effectively. That's what it means. You have to coordinate activities on the same side that are there. So, and that involves balance. Anytime you make a gesture with something, you have to support yourself on the other side. There's a lot that goes on. They have hemispheres and they have gray matter. So it has a cortex, external gray matter as well. So the connection, which you do see a little bit on the sheep, is called the vermis because it looks like a little worm. The gyri, like in the pons, are oriented more transversely. So it's very distinctive. It has a variety of lobes. And most importantly, it has a very distinctive area of white matter when you look at what we call the hemisection, you're going to see shortly, called the arbor vitae. Originally, arbor vitae means tree of life. Arbor for tree, vitae for life. Arbor Day. Tree of Life's a big thing. That's the synagogue where the terrible shooting was here in Pittsburgh, where I was married in 1978. Guy I went to high school was murdered. Was one of the victims of that tragic shooting. Just saying. Like the whole network of people in our graduating high school class, people are reaching out to me. Lou, were you at the synagogue that day? No, but Dr. Jerry Rabinowitz was. So moving on. How we got here from Springfield, New Jersey, no one will know. Nevertheless, tree of life, when anatomists looked at that cross section, they saw a tree-like structure. Okay, there's probably more synapses there than anything else. These Purkinje fibers and Purkinje is a name that's usually associated with the heart as well, though we don't use that term as much anymore. These Purkinje fibers come from the cortex, and then within the cerebellum, they're inside of that area. And there's even a cerebellar homunculus. This is what it looks like in real life. Here's the fourth ventricle. Here's the choroid plexus. Here's the white matter, and you can see it branching out like a tree. So anatomists thought this was really where everything was coming from. That was there. And you can see the way the gyri are oriented differently. Here again, you can see it a little bit more schematically. That's there. You can see the choroid plexus. And they'll have peduncles that go up, called cerebellar peduncles. You have peduncles that go down, inferior, so they could be bringing signals up, sending signals to the brain, receiving signals, and even ones that go across, that are sort of cut away there. Here's what it looks like Okay. And so, and that's that sort of vermis area, that sort of midline area. And so all of those things, all the fibers are ipsilateral from the same side of the body. So left stays left, right stays right. Here are the connections. Same illustration. Receives inputs of when your brain saying, hey, I'm going to move my arm. I'm going to take a step forward. Now your cerebellum knows. Okay. At the same time, it's receiving information from proprioceptors in your body, from your feet, from your arms, from your back, to continuously inform you of your position, momentum, movement, best way to smoothly coordinate, and it blueprints it, okay? So that all the structures involved in motor activity have basically this imprint on their hard drive, and we store it. So that's another area where we hear about muscle memory. Muscle memory is very interesting. And that, so Sarah, yes, sir.
So is that why, like, in boxing, it's illegal to punch someone in the back of the head?
The rabbit punch, yeah, a couple of reasons. Yeah, I mean it's more dangerous that way, and traditional boxing was always something that was coming at you rather than being in a clutch and doing it from the side. So there's a potential for more damage. I would agree. There's also from this way for kidney punches, which were very damaging, put into the torso itself, because that could really hurt somebody. You get bleeding in the kidney. So I mean, it's and in amateur boxing or Olympic boxing, they always have headgear. Right? But in professional boxing, they do not. I don't know if that answers the question, but that is part of it would be the back of the head. So neuroimaging, it plays a role in other stuff as well. So, and it's funny, anatomists, if you go back and look at that other picture that was here, when they looked at this, they kind of conjured up an image like there was a little person in there directing traffic. I think that's clever. Now, cerebellum. So you need three things, and what these three things are part of is something called Romberg sign. You need to have your cerebellum, your sight, and your proprioceptors. And the rule is 2 out of 3. So as long as you have 2 out of 3 of those, basically you can maintain your balance. So, for instance, somebody who, you and I can, we can close our eyes and feel with our feet and get a sense that we're walking generally to an area, particularly someone who's lost their sight, they're familiar with their environment, or they have like an aid, they're able to do that. So they're not falling over. Now, if you see somebody who's lost their proprioceptors, like a diabetic, okay, and even tertiary syphilis has something called tabes dorsalis, which affects these dorsal columns in the back. They walk like this. So they can't feel their feet. And they don't have, and their sensorium, their proprioceptors don't work, so they have to look where I'm going to put my foot here, put my foot here. So they're almost staring down. So it's all part of gait analysis. We employ Romberg sign all the time, and I'm sure none of you have been involved in a field test. Hope for this. What? Field test. Have you ever? What happens when perhaps you're driving erratically and they want you to close your eyes and touch your fingertips? That kind of test.
I don't drink and drive.
I would never accuse you. That's what it's all about. So what do people do? They start laughing hysterically because they go, okay, close your eyes, touch your finger to your nose, and they're kind of like, you know, that's what, because you're missing 3. Alcohol of tons, the cerebellum. Alcohol affects the cerebellum, so you can't process the information. Close your eyes. Now you don't have, you're missing, now 2 of the 3 are gone. And so your balance is messed up. You can't walk the straight line, all that type of stuff. That's the whole idea of what Romberg sign is. And none of you had better be familiar with it. Why is he hiding?
Was he hiding? I don't know.
Oh, just wondering. Maybe he felt guilty.
No. Just
Yeah, it would never happen to a softball player.
long day.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Long day. 2 long summers there.
Ah, yes. And let us, we're about ready to conclude this part of the presentation. Hold on. And I'll tell you about this one. So we have a minute or two left just to sort of amplify where we're going. Yeah, I'll show you the limbic system and the reticular formation. So these are on the interior, when they say the medial aspect, divided in half. So this is almost like going down, and you'll do this hemisection on the interior walls, both left and right. You have a tract called the fornix, which is sort of incorporates all of these. So there's parts of the diencephalon, cerebral structures. The amygdala or amygdaloid body, that's your anger and fear center. Typically, when you see people with anger management issues, this is where it operates from. The cingulate gyrus is a gyrus that surrounds that corpus callosum. So here's what the limbic system looks like. Smell is part of it. So it involves the olfactory bulb. It involves the mammillary bodies. This is the fornix going around that way. Here's the cingulate gyrus directly around the corpus callosum that's there. The amygdaloid body, you can see over here, if you follow the arrow, it's like a bulbous expansion of gray matter on that interior area. And this very interesting structure is called the hippocampus. And the hippocampus plays a significant role in memory, particularly short-term memory. And that's why we have a strong suspicion that that's one of the early areas affected in Alzheimer's disease presentations, because they lose short-term memory. It's interesting. Long-term memory is there, but short-term memory is not. Like someone they won't recognize who they're. I mean, I saw my mom deteriorate over a couple of years, period. And every so often there'd be a moment of recollection. It's for many of you, and if you haven't seen it, unfortunately, you may very well. So the limbic system, emotional responses, we think it plays a role in some people with psychosomatic illnesses. There's a lot of people like that. I mean, how many people do you know when they read there's a new COVID variant? Oh my God, I'm going to die tomorrow. You know, there's plenty of folks like that. And psychosomatic illnesses are more common than you think. So prefrontal lobes react emotionally. So emotions enrich our lives. I don't think there's any question about it. And so it's an important part, and it's the old story. It's not so easy to control. We'll stop here. We'll pick up with the reticular formation. We'll finish most of this except for the spinal cord on Friday. Maybe we'll start spinal cord.